Hello there, sophomores. Mrs. House here. What I'm going to do for Chapter 7 is I am going to go ahead and show you all of the pages that I have annotated over the years, like I did in the last lecture for Chapter 3. And I'm going to read this whole thing to you. I'm going to pause intermittently to explain some significant passages. And of course, as you watch this video, you're going to be able to see some of my notes that I've made over the years. First thing to note is in the very top of each page, something I've done is I've put keywords and phrases to help me remember what's happened on that page. Now, obviously, you can't do that on your school-issued book, but I find this kind of technique a great strategy for classes where I'm trying to remember what things I'm reading on which pages. So maybe that's something you'll be able to take away from today's lecture. Also, things that are highlighted in yellow are things that I have highlighted to indicate that a theme is showing up there. Things in green are typically imagery, figurative language, sentence structure, interesting diction. And then things in pink are the night and eyes motif and symbols. So hopefully that helps you. And I think, oh wait, also blue is when there is any kind of timeline or location change or some sort of important fact. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and begin Chapter 7 together. It says, pressed up against the others in an effort to keep out the cold, head empty and heavy at the same time, brain a whirlpool of decaying memories. Indifference deadened the spirit. Here or elsewhere, what difference did it make? To die today or tomorrow or later. The night was long and never ending. Now, obviously, there you see his emotional death. He no longer cares. What difference does it make whether the people are decaying around him or not? To die today or tomorrow or later doesn't matter. And there we see that motif or that symbol of night. When at last a gray glimmer of light appeared on the horizon, it revealed a tangle of human shapes. Heads sunk upon shoulders, crouched, piled one on top of the other, like a field of dust-covered tombstones in the first light of the dawn. I tried to distinguish those who were still alive from those who had gone, but there was no difference. My gaze was held for a long time by one who lay with his eyes open, staring into the void. His livid face was covered with a layer of frost and snow. My father was huddled near me, wrapped in his blanket, his shoulders covered with snow. And was he dead, too? I called him. No answer. I would have cried out if I could have done so. He did not move. My mind was invaded suddenly by this realization. There was no more reason to live, no more reason to struggle. The train stopped in the middle of a deserted field. The suddenness of the halt woke some of those who were asleep. They straightened themselves up, throwing startled looks around them. Outside, the SS went by, shouting, "Throw out all the dead! All corpses, outside!" The living rejoiced. There would be more room. Volunteers set to work. They felt those who were still crouching. "Here's one! Take him!" They undressed him, the survivors avidly sharing out his clothes. Then two grave diggers took him one by the head and one by the feet, and threw him out of the wagon like a sack of flour. From all directions came cries, "Come here! Here's one! This man next to me! He doesn't move!" I woke from my apathy just at the moment when two men came up to my father. I threw myself on top of his body. He was cold. I slapped him. I rubbed his hands, crying, "Father, father, wake up! They're trying to throw you out of the carriage." His body remained inert, or meaning lacking some sort of strength to move. The two gravediggers seized me by the collar. "Leave him! You can see perfectly well that he's dead." "No!" I cried. "He isn't dead, not yet." I set to work to slap him as hard as I could. After a moment, my father's eyelids moved slightly over his glazed eyes. He was breathing weakly. "You see?" I cried. and the two men moved away. So here you can see by my notes, we have another example of his commitment to his father. This could have been an opportunity for him to let go of this weight of having to take care of his father. But we still see him as somebody who is doing whatever possible, even if it means slapping his father violently to get him to possibly wake up from this frozen stupor in order for him to still stay in his life. But you can see how desperate everyone was to get other people's clothes, because they're desperately trying to stay alive too in this horrible, horrible freezing cold. And if you're looking for more examples of eyes, you're going to see a couple different examples in the pages coming up as we finish our memoir, as we get to look at Ellie's father and how his eyes change over time. So I welcome you to look at that with me. Moving on. The two men moved away. Now here's the sad part, you guys. It says 20 bodies were thrown out of our wagon. Then the train resumed its journey, leaving behind it a few hundred naked dead, deprived of burial in the deep snow of a field in Poland. Now we contrast that, you guys, to the earlier chapters where we learn about them giving the Kaddish, the prayer of the dead in the Jewish culture and religion. And now we see this stark contrast where that is not happening for all of these dead bodies. They are just thrown out as if their life had very little significance. Next page. We were given no food. We lived on snow. It took the place of bread. The days were like nights. Now there's a significant passage for you guys. And the nights left the dregs of the darkness in our souls. The train was traveling slowly, often stopping for several hours and then setting off again. It never ceased or stopped snowing. All through these days and nights we stayed crouching, one on top of the other, never speaking a word. We were no more than frozen bodies. Our eyes closed. We waited merely for the next stop so that we could unload our dead. So they have this endless night, right? Even the days were like nights. And we know at this point in the memoir that night is symbolic of death and destruction and horrible, horrible experiences. But here we see their eyes, really their only purpose for their soul and their spirit, as we see through their eyes, is simply to wait for the next opportunity to get rid of more bodies, only so that they can steal those bodies' clothes, those bodies' shoes, to keep themselves warm. Moving on. 10 days, 10 nights of traveling. So keep that in mind, you guys. They are not eating. They are simply trying to stay alive. And the only thing they have to keep them alive is the clothes on their back, whether it was theirs or someone else's, and the eating of snow to keep themselves hydrated. Sometimes we would pass through German townships, very early in the morning usually. The workmen were going to work. They stopped and stared after us, but otherwise showed no surprise. One day, when we had stopped, a workman took a piece of bread out of his bag and threw it into a wagon. There was a stampede. Dozens of starving men fought each other to the death for a few crumbs. The German workmen took a lively interest in this spectacle. Now you see here that I wrote cruel. And you would think that that's not cruel, right? That the intent of that German person was maybe philanthropic, trying to give these starving people food. But they're so hungry and there's so little food for each person if you throw that in, that it actually causes more of a ruckus. And they use up much needed energy just to stay alive to go after that food. Now, what Elie Wiesel does in this next passage is pretty interesting. So I ask you this question before I read. What message about charity is Wiesel cautioning about? So he does a flashback here, and I want you to think about that question. Here we go. Some years later, I watched the same kind of scene at Aden, which is a city in Yemen. The passengers on our boat were amusing themselves by throwing coins to the, quote, natives, who were diving in to get them. An attractive, aristocratic Parisian, someone from Paris, was deriving special pleasure from the game. Interesting choice of words there, right, guys? He calls this a game. I suddenly noticed that two children were engaged in a death struggle, trying to strangle each other. So I turned to the lady. Please, I begged, don't throw any more money in. You're throwing it, in so that the children go and grab the money because they're so poor. They're so in need of this money. And then she says, why not? I like to give to charity. And that's the end of his flashback. And then he comments and says, in the wagon, so now he's back in the Holocaust. It's no longer this flashback, or I guess a flash forward in this time. He says, in the wagon where the bread had fallen, a real battle had broken out. Men threw themselves on top of each other, stamping on each other, tearing at each other, biting each other. Wild beasts of prey with animal hatred in their eyes. An extraordinary vitality had seized them, sharpening their teeth and nails. A crowd of workmen and curious spectators had collected along the train. They had probably never seen a train with such a cargo. Soon, nearly everywhere, pieces of bread were being dropped into the wagons. So now you guys got to see this connection to his later experience in Yemen. The audience stared. The audience in this case are the Germans who are just going about their day. They stared at these skeletons of men fighting one another to the death for a mouthful. A piece fell into our wagon. I decided that I would not move. Anyway, I knew that I would never have the strength to fight with a dozen savage men. Oh my gosh. Why is Siri talking to me? Sorry, guys. Okay. A piece fell into our wagon. I did that. Not far away, I noticed an old man dragging himself along on all fours. He was trying to disengage himself from the struggle. He held one hand to his heart. I thought at first he had received a blow in the chest, which is why he would be holding his heart, right? Then I understood. He had a bit of bread under his shirt. With remarkable speed, he drew it out and put it to his mouth. His eyes gleamed. A smile, like a grimace. A grimace is like that face you make when you're in pain, right? Lit up his dead face and was immediately extinguished. A shadow had just loomed up near him. The shadow threw itself upon him. Fell to the ground, stunned with blows, the old man cried. Are you guys ready for this? Mir, my boy, don't you recognize me? I'm your father. You're hurting me. You're killing your father. I've got some bread for you too. And then he collapsed. His fist was still clenched around a small piece. He tried to carry it to his mouth, but the other one threw himself upon him and snatched it. The old man again whispered something let out a rattle, and died amid the general indifference. Everyone around him didn't care. Indifference. His son searched him, took the bread, and began to devour it. He was not able to get very far. Two men had seen and hurled themselves upon him. Others joined in. When they withdrew, next to me were two corpses, side by side, the father and the son. I was 15 years old. Now, this is obviously a great place to pause. We have a couple questions to discuss and for you guys to think about. I asked you earlier, what message about charity is Wiesel cautioning about? And I'm going to definitely ask that question in one of your TDQs. I want you to think about what he's cautioning or warning people about the difference between philanthropy and selfless giving and a spectacle and the expected outcomes of things. On this page, we see this theme of personal survival and family commitment right here, definitely taking a turn for the worse. Here we have yet another example of a father and son that Ellie shares with us. And this time, again, we have the son completely betraying the father. And we can assume that up until this point, they have been protecting each other. They're obviously still together. but he beats his father because he wants the food so bad. What kind of anger or what kind of hunger would you have to feel in order to do that to your own parent? And that's what you need to do. That's what you need to think about as you're reading these pages, is these were not just imaginary characters. These were humans that experienced this. And what would it take for you to get to that point? And of course, the heart pang down here, what I mean by heart pang is like man, I can't believe that happened, is in the end, it didn't matter. Because there's always going to be somebody bigger, it's always going to be somebody stronger, or somebody more desperate in need of what you have. And then I really like how Elie Wiesel does this at the end. And he does this a lot throughout his writing. He says, quite simply, I was 15 years old. Now, he could have said there, I experienced all of this horrible, horrible things and these horrendous ordeals, and these images stay in my mind forever, and I'll never forget this event. And he could go on and on. Instead, though, all he says is, I was 15 years old, period. And I want you to think about that a little bit, guys, and why it is he does that and what impact that has on us as readers. For him just to make that simple statement, why is that impactful? And we'll come back to that in the TDQ later. So let's go ahead and finish this chapter. We see this gap here in time, which means time or location has probably changed. And we begin by reading, in our wagon, there was a friend of my father's called Meerkats. So here's a new character for us to get introduced to. He had worked as a gardener at Buna and used to bring us a few green vegetables occasionally. Being less undernourished than the rest of us, he had stood up to imprisonment better. So he was slightly healthier, right? Because he was relatively more vigorous, or healthier in this case, he had been put in charge of the wagon. On the third night of our journey, I woke up suddenly and felt two hands on my throat, trying to strangle me. I just had the time to shout, "Father!" Nothing but this word. I felt myself suffocating, but my father had woken up and seized my attacker. Too weak to overcome him, he had the idea of calling Meerkats. So just to clarify, Meerkats is not the one attacking him. There's somebody else trying to strangle Elie Wiesel. "Come here! Come quickly! There's someone strangling my son!" So obviously that's his father calling. A few moments later, I was free. I still do not know why the man wanted to strangle me. So, of course, right now you're thinking, okay, why is he telling us this? Nothing happened. But this is going to lead into another part of the story. So now we know that Meerkats came and saved him. After a few days, Meerkats spoke to my father. "Shlomo." Now we know his father's name. "I'm getting weak. I'm losing my strength. I can't hold on." "Don't let yourself go under," my father said, trying to encourage him. "You must resist. Don't lose faith in yourself." But Meerkats groaned heavily in reply. "I can't go on any longer, Shlomo. What can I do? I can't carry on." My father took his arm, and Meerkats, the strong man, the most robust of us all, wept. He cried, you guys. His son had been taken from him at the time of the first selection, but it was now that he wept. It was now that he cracked up. He was finished at the end of his tether. I want you guys to look that word up real quick and pause my video. What does it mean to tether something? And then once you figure out what it means to tether something, what message do you think Elie is sending us about this animal-like quality? This isn't the first time he's talked about the men in this wagon as being animalistic. He refers to them as savage men earlier. He refers to them as wild beasts of prey. And here he has this example of tether. So if you guys are thinking about the dehumanization theme and you still need evidence for your lit tracker, you might want to think about how Elie Wiesel is metaphorically treating the men in this wagon as animals. Or I shouldn't say treating, he's describing them as such. Why is that? It's not because he felt they were animals. He's trying to convey something. And what is that? I want you guys to think about that. On the last day of our journey, a terrible wind arose. It snowed without ceasing or ending. We felt that the end was near, the real end. So not just the end of the tracks, but in this case, the end of life. We could never hold out in this icy wind, in these gusts. Someone got up and shouted, "We mustn't stay sitting down at a time like this. We shall freeze to death. Let's all get up and move a bit." So we all got up. We held our damp blankets more tightly around us, and we forced ourselves to move a few steps, to turn around where we were. Suddenly, a cry rose up from the wagon, the cry of a wounded animal. There it is again. Someone had just died. Others, feeling that they too were about to die, imitated his cry, and their cries seemed to come from beyond the grave. In other words, somewhere so deep in their soul that it resonated so loudly in everyone's ears. Soon everyone was crying out, wailing, groaning, cries of distress hurled into the wind and the snow. The contagion, again, that choice of words here. Why is Elie Wiesel using the word contagion? You guys should pause the video now and look that up. What is the connotation of that word? The contagion spread to the other carriages. Hundreds of cries rose up simultaneously, meaning at the same time. Not knowing against whom we cried, not knowing why. The death rattle of a whole convoy meaning a group of wagons in the train, who felt the end upon them. We were all going to die here. All limits had been passed. No one had any strength left, and again, the night would be long. There's that night word again, guys. Meerkats groaned. "Why don't they shoot us all right away?" So then a pause, and it says, that same evening, we reached our destination. It was late at night. The guards came to unload us. The dead were abandoned in the train. Only those who could still stand were able to get out. Meerkats stayed in the train. The last day had been the most murderous. 100 of us had got into the wagon. 12 of us got out. Among them, my father and I. We had arrived at Buchenwald. A lot of his memoir here, I'll just say this in closing and before you move on to chapters 8 and 9. A lot of his memoir talks about how him and his father are able to stay together. And it's easy to think that maybe it's because they loved each other so much, or it's because they helped each other and they wouldn't let each other go and their commitment to each other. And while a lot of that is true, and there is plenty of evidence to suggest that had they not had each other, their chances of survival would have been significantly lessened. There also, I want to express to you, there's also the sense that they just got really lucky, right? I mean, statistically speaking, if you use this as one example, 100 men went into just that one wagon of the train, and only 12 came out. That's 12%, you guys. It's not looking very good for a lot of them. So it is nothing short of a miracle that up until this point, both father and son are still together. And I pass you off to our other sophomore English teachers to read chapter 8 and 9 to you. And I wish you a great rest of your day. And hopefully the reading of chapter 7 has helped you to envision what the horrors of their travels were like and helped you to understand what kind of mindset Elie Wiesel is as he enters into Buchenwald. Thank you very much.